The moon hung low over the temple of Amun, its silvery glow casting long shadows across the sacred ground. Inside the vast hall, torches flickered against the ancient stone walls, their flames barely holding back the thick shroud of darkness. A lone priest knelt before the colossal statue of the god, trembling as a mysterious wind howled through the temple. Suddenly, the air grew heavy. The statue's eyes seemed to glow faintly, and a deep, resonant voice filled the chamber. The bloodline must not falter. The voice boomed, chilling the priest to his core. The message was cryptic yet urgent, a warning that something sacred had been broken. The priest gasped, clutching the amulet hanging around his neck. The gods were restless, and their wrath was imminent. He rose shakily to his feet, knowing he must carry this divine message to Pharaoh Akhenaten without delay. In the grand palace, Pharaoh Akhenaten sat on his gilded throne, his face etched with exhaustion. The burden of ruling a kingdom plagued by famine and unrest had taken its toll. Just as he leaned back to take a rare moment of rest, a guard entered, announcing the arrival of a high priest bearing urgent news. The priest, pale and visibly shaken, approached the throne. "Great Pharaoh," he began, his voice trembling, "I bring a message from the gods themselves." He recounted the events at the temple, sparing no detail of the ominous voice and its cryptic warning. Akhenaten listened intently, his fingers gripping the throne's armrests. "What do the gods demand of me?" he asked, his voice low but filled with dread. "The bloodline must be preserved," the priest replied, bowing low. "If you defy this decree, great calamity will befall Egypt. The gods have spoken." The pharaoh's face darkened. He dismissed the priest with a wave, but sat motionless for a long time, the weight of the warning pressing down on him like a crushing tide. That night, Akhenaten paced his chambers, the priest's words echoing in his mind. He could feel the gods' presence, their unseen eyes watching his every move. The cryptic nature of the warning only deepened his unease. The pharaoh summoned his chief advisor, Imhotep, a man known for his wisdom. After hearing the priest's account, Imhotep spoke gravely. "Pharaoh, the gods' words must be heeded, but their true meaning is often cloaked in shadows. We must uncover their intentions before it is too late." The room grew cold, and a gust of wind extinguished the candles. Akhenaten froze, feeling an otherworldly presence close by. His hands clenched into fists. If the gods had singled out his bloodline, then their decree would affect his daughter, Ankhesenamun. "Prepare for an inquiry into the divine," Akhenaten commanded. "We must uncover the truth of this prophecy before it consumes us." The once prosperous lands of Egypt were now parched under an unrelenting sun. The Nile, the lifeblood of the kingdom, had receded, leaving barren fields and empty granaries. Farmers whispered of curses, while merchants abandoned their caravans in fear of bandits. In the marketplaces, cries of hunger grew louder, a cacophony that echoed the despair spreading throughout the kingdom. Pharaoh Akhenaten stood on the palace balcony, gazing at the distant horizon where the Nile once shimmered with life. Below, unrest brewed among his people. Armed guards lined the streets to quell any uprising, but whispers of rebellion reached even the most fortified chambers of the palace. The royal court convened daily, yet no solution could be agreed upon. "The gods are angry," murmured one advisor. Another countered, "This is no divine wrath, this is politics." But Akhenaten knew the truth was far more dangerous. The kingdom's survival hung by a thread, and now, with the priest's prophecy, that thread felt ready to snap. The tension within the palace was as palpable as the unrest outside. Akhenaten had spent years strengthening Egypt's borders, building alliances, and securing his power. Yet one matter had remained unresolved: his heir. His only child, Princess Ankhesenamun, was beloved by the people for her grace and wisdom, but tradition demanded a male successor. Without a son, the royal bloodline was vulnerable, and rivals to the throne would undoubtedly rise. Akhenaten's advisors urged him to remarry, to take another wife who might bear him a son. But the pharaoh's heart remained with Queen Nefertiti, even though their union had yet to provide the heir he so desperately needed. Now, with the gods' warning hanging over him, Akhenaten feared that his failure to secure his lineage had angered the divine. Time was running out, and the weight of his dynasty's survival pressed heavily on his shoulders. Princess Ankhesenamun stood in the palace gardens, her silk robes shimmering in the morning light. Though only 16, she carried herself with a poise far beyond her years. She had grown up under the watchful eyes of her father, who had instilled in her a deep sense of duty to the kingdom. As she tended to the flowers, she noticed servants and guards stealing glances at her, their faces shadowed with unease. She overheard whispers of the prophecy and the God's will. Though no one dared to speak directly to her, the weight of their fear reached her like a cold wind. Ankhesenamun's heart ached for her father. She knew of his struggles to protect the kingdom and maintain order. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was somehow tied to the unease gripping the palace. She was no ordinary princess. She was her father's only child, the last thread of the royal lineage. She prayed silently to the gods, asking for guidance, unaware that her prayers were already part of a much larger plan. That evening, as the palace prepared for another restless night, a priest from the temple of Hathor arrived at the gates, demanding an audience with the pharaoh. His face was pale, and his hands clutched a scroll tightly, as if it held the weight of the world. Akhenaten received the priest in the Hall of Kings, his advisors standing by with anxious expressions. The priest bowed deeply before unfurling the scroll. "Great Pharaoh, the gods have spoken again. Their message is clear." The pharaoh's eyes narrowed as he read the scroll, his expression growing darker with each line. The words seemed to burn into his mind. The bloodline is sacred. Only through union can the god's wrath be appeased. The daughter must unite with the father to preserve the divine order. Gasps erupted among the advisors. One stepped forward, his voice trembling. "This cannot be, my pharaoh. Such a decree is unthinkable." Akhenaten silenced him with a wave of his hand. He turned to the priest, his voice like steel. "Do the gods truly demand this?" The priest lowered his gaze. "Their will is absolute, Pharaoh. To deny it is to doom the kingdom." The chamber fell silent, the weight of the decree suffocating. Akhenaten dismissed everyone, retreating to his private chambers. Alone, he stared at the scroll, his mind reeling. The god's demand was not only sacrilegious but would also shatter his family and his own soul. Pharaoh Akhenaten summoned his most trusted priests to the palace at dawn. The high priest of Amun, the scribe of Thoth, and the oracle of Isis gathered in the sacred council chamber, their faces lined with worry. The air was heavy with incense and tension as Akhenaten revealed the contents of the scroll. The high priest's voice broke the silence. "Pharaoh, the gods' decree must not be questioned. Their wrath is absolute." "But their words are vague," the scribe interjected, his hands trembling as he clutched an ancient tome. "We must decipher the full meaning. This union, it may not be literal. There could be another way to appease the gods." The oracle, her face pale and distant, whispered, "There is no escape from their will." To disobey is to invite destruction. Akhenaten clenched his fists. If the gods demand the impossible, am I to sacrifice my soul and my daughter's future for the kingdom's survival? The priests exchanged uneasy glances. You are Pharaoh, the high priest finally said. Your bloodline is the bridge between the divine and mortal realms. The gods demand what they demand. Akhenaten dismissed the priests, his heart heavy. Their counsel offered no solace, only confirming that the burden of this curse fell solely on him. Alone in his chambers, Akhenaten paced the floor, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. The words of the prophecy echoed in his mind, each repetition cutting deeper. He thought of Ankhesenamun, her laughter filling the palace when she was a child. She had been his joy, a reminder of his love for Queen Nefertiti. How could he now consider such a monstrous decree? The gods had tested him before, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He poured wine into a goblet, his hands shaking. His reflection in the liquid was unrecognizable, a ruler trapped between love for his daughter and duty to his kingdom. That evening, he sat before Nefertiti's shrine, seeking guidance. "My queen," he murmured, his voice breaking, "if you were here, you would know what to do. Tell me, how can I protect our daughter without condemning Egypt?" The candles flickered, and for a brief moment, he felt her presence. But no answers came, only the oppressive silence of the gods. The palace buzzed with unease as servants and officials noticed the pharaoh's growing isolation. Whispers of the prophecy spread like wildfire, though none dared speak openly about it. In the royal court, advisors speculated. "The pharaoh consults the priests daily," one murmured. "The gods' demands must be dire." "I've heard it concerns the princess," another said, his voice low. "Why else would Ankhesenamun be so closely guarded now?" The rumors reached the ears of Ankhesenamun's handmaidens. Though loyal, even they couldn't contain their curiosity. What could the gods want with her? One asked nervously. The palace halls seemed darker, the tension almost tangible. It was as if the gods seeped into the very stones, filling the air with dread. Ankhesenamun sat in her chambers, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. Her father entered, his face weary and lined with sorrow. She rose to greet him, sensing something was deeply wrong. "Father," she said softly, "what troubles you?" Akhenaten hesitated, his throat tightening. How could he burden her with the truth? But she deserved to know. "Ankhesenamun," he began, his voice trembling, "the gods have spoken. Their decree, it concerns you." Her heart sank. "What do they demand of me?" He struggled to find the words, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "They demand a union," he said finally, the words tasting bitter. "Between us." Ankhesenamun recoiled, her eyes wide with shock. "That cannot be true," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The gods would not demand such a thing." "They have," Akhenaten said, tears welling in his eyes. "And if we defy them, Egypt will fall." She turned away, her mind racing. The gods she had prayed to all her life now felt like cruel strangers. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I need to understand." Desperate for alternatives, Akhenaten called a secret council of his most trusted advisors. Imhotep, the chief advisor, was the first to speak. "Pharaoh, the gods' decree is clear, but there may be another way to interpret their will." The vizier nodded. "The gods often test us through riddles. Perhaps the union they demand is symbolic, not literal." "But what if it isn't?" another advisor argued. "If we defy them, the kingdom could collapse." We cannot gamble with Egypt's future." The debate grew heated, with voices rising and tempers flaring. Akhenaten listened silently, his face a mask of resolve. When the council fell silent, he spoke. "If we fail to act, the gods' wrath will consume us. Yet if we act rashly, we may doom our very souls. I will seek clarity from the gods themselves." The council disbanded, leaving Akhenaten alone with his thoughts once more. The following night, Akhenaten returned to the temple of Amun, seeking a sign. The air was thick with incense as he knelt before the statue of the god. "Great Amun," he prayed, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall, "if this decree is true or will, give me a sign. Show me the path I must take." The torches flickered, and a chilling wind swept through the temple. The statue's eyes seemed to glow faintly, and Akhenaten felt a heavy presence pressing down on him. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the chamber. "Defies, and Egypt will crumble. Obey, and the bloodline will endure." Akhenaten trembled, tears streaming down his face. The gods' message was clear, but the weight of their demand was unbearable. He rose slowly, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his choices were no longer his own. The announcement of the royal union spread across Egypt like wildfire. Though the details were shrouded in secrecy, rumors swirled that the gods themselves had decreed the union. Official proclamations declared it an act of divine will, essential for the kingdom's survival, but whispers of disbelief and outrage echoed among the people. In the palace, preparations moved at a feverish pace. The grand hall was transformed into a space of opulent splendor, with gilded columns, cascading flowers, and an altar adorned with sacred relics. Priests chanted prayers day and night, invoking blessings from the gods. Yet, beneath the surface of celebration, lay tension. Servants avoided eye contact with one another, and the palace guards stood rigid, their faces blank. Even the royal family seemed subdued, their smiles forced. Princess Ankhesenamun's chambers were a hive of activity, as handmaidens adorned her in a gown of gold and turquoise, her hair braided and crowned with jewels. She sat silently, her hands trembling as the weight of her fate bore down on her. In the grand hall, Akhenaten, dressed in ceremonial robes, looked every bit the pharaoh, but his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. The night before the ceremony, Akhenaten retreated to the temple, his heart heavy with doubt. He knelt before the statue of Amun, his voice breaking as he prayed. "Great Amun, I have obeyed your will," he pleaded, his tears falling freely. "But I beg you, show me another path. Spare my daughter from this fate. Spare me from this sin." The temple remained silent, save for the faint crackling of the torches. Akhenaten's desperation grew. "If this is truly your will, give me a sign. Show me that this is the only way." A sudden gust of wind extinguished the torches, plunging the chamber into darkness. Akhenaten froze, his breath shallow. He felt the weight of unseen eyes upon him, and a voice filled the void. "The path is chosen. You cannot escape." The pharaoh fell to the floor, his body racked with sobs. He returned to the palace with no answers, only the crushing certainty that he was walking a path from which there was no return. As dawn approached, Princess Ankhesenamun stood by the window of her chambers, staring at the Nile in the distance. She longed for its gentle flow to carry her far from the palace, far from the weight of her destiny. Her handmaidens fussed over her attire, adjusting the folds of her golden gown and arranging the intricate patterns of her headdress. But she barely noticed. Her mind was consumed by a storm of emotions, anger, sorrow, and betrayal. "Leave me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The handmaidens hesitated but obeyed, bowing as they exited. Alone, Ankhesenamun sank to the floor, her tears finally breaking free. "Why have the gods chosen me for this?" she whispered. "Why must I be the sacrifice?" She thought of her father, his love for her, evident even in his silence. She knew he was as much a prisoner of this prophecy as she was, yet it offered little comfort. Her duty to her kingdom clashed with her sense of self, tearing her apart. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Ankhesenamun rose, her resolve hardening. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with the dignity of a queen. The grand hall was filled with nobles, priests, and foreign dignitaries, all gathered for the union that would seal Egypt's fate. The priests chanted hymns as Ankhesenamun and Akhenaten entered, their faces masks of calm despite the turmoil within. Just as the ceremony began, a commotion erupted at the entrance. A figure dressed in tattered robes burst into the hall, his voice booming over the chants. "Stop this madness!" The crowd gasped as the figure revealed himself to be a former high priest, exiled years ago for challenging the gods' authority. "This prophecy is no divine will," he declared. "It is a curse born of human greed and betrayal." The room fell silent as the priest explained. Decades ago, a jealous rival of Akhenaten's bloodline had conspired with dark forces to place a curse on his lineage. The prophecy was not the gods' decree, but the result of a mortal's vengeance. The gods demanded the union not to uphold divine will, but to break the curse and restore balance. Akhenaten's face contorted with fury and despair. "Why was I not told?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The priest bowed his head. "The truth was buried, Pharaoh. Only now has it come to light." Ankhesenamun's gaze shifted to her father, the weight of the revelation crashing down on her. The ceremony continued, but the truth left a shadow that would linger long after the vows were spoken. The grand hall was eerily silent as the final vows were spoken. Pharaoh Akhenaten and Princess Ankhesenamun stood before the altar, their faces pale but resolute. The priests pronounced the union as sanctified, their chants rising to the heavens as the crowd looked on, uncertain whether to cheer or weep. As the ceremony concluded, Akhenaten retreated to his chambers, his steps heavy with the weight of what he had done. The sacred union had been carried out, but instead of relief, he felt hollow. His mind replayed the exiled priest's words, the revelation of the curse haunting him. Meanwhile, Ankhesenamun wandered the palace gardens, her golden gown trailing behind her. The air felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. She could feel the eyes of the court upon her, their judgment cutting deeper than any blade. Her heart ached, not for herself, but for the people of Egypt. She had done her duty, but at what cost? The kingdom watched and waited, uncertain whether the gods would respond with blessings or wrath. The sun rose and set, but no divine sign came. Anxiety gripped the palace, and whispers of doubt spread like wildfire. Had the pharaoh truly appeased the gods, or had the union doomed them all? One fateful night, the skies above Thebes erupted with a violent storm. Lightning split the heavens, and thunder shook the earth. The Nile, long stagnant and receded, began to swell with a ferocious current. The people of Egypt, awakened by the chaos, fell to their knees in prayer, begging the gods for mercy. In the temple, Akhenaten stood before the altar, trembling. "Great Amun, have we fulfilled your will?" he cried out, his voice echoing through the sacred halls. "Tell me, have we saved Egypt?" A sudden burst of wind extinguished the torches, plunging the temple into darkness. Then a deep, resonant voice filled the chamber. "The curse is broken, but your bloodline carries the stain of this act. Egypt will prosper, but your name will bear the weight of judgment for generations." Akhenaten collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down his face. The gods had accepted the union, sparing Egypt from ruin, but their judgment was harsh. His dynasty would be remembered, not for its greatness, but for the sacrifice it had made. The next morning, the Nile overflowed its banks, bringing life back to the parched fields. The people rejoiced, believing the gods had forgiven them. But in the palace, the royal family carried a burden too heavy to share. Though the kingdom celebrated its revival, the royal family found no solace. The bond between Akhenaten and Ankhesenamun was irrevocably shattered. They spoke little, each lost in their own turmoil. Ankhesenamun avoided her father, her heart filled with a mix of pity and resentment. She understood the necessity of their actions, but the emotional scars were too deep to heal. Her once bright spirit had dimmed, replaced by a quiet resolve to endure. Akhenaten, too, withdrew from those around him. He spent hours alone in the temple, seeking forgiveness from the gods and his ancestors. The weight of the gods' judgment hung heavy on him, a constant reminder of the price he had paid to save his kingdom. Even the palace servants noticed the change. The once vibrant halls felt cold and distant, the royal family fractured by the dark secret they now shared. Years later, the story of the union faded into legend, spoken of in hushed tones by the people of Egypt. The fields flourished, the Nile flowed steadily, and the kingdom prospered. Yet, the shadow of the union lingered, a quiet reminder of the gods' power and the cost of their favor. Ankhesenamun grew into a wise and resilient leader, guiding the kingdom with grace. Though her bond with her father remained strained, she carried the lessons of sacrifice and duty with her. Her people adored her, calling her the Queen of Resilience. Akhenaten, however, retreated further into isolation. His health waned, and as his reign neared its end, he confided in his closest advisors. "The gods spared Egypt, but I fear they cursed my soul," he whispered. When he passed, the kingdom mourned, though his legacy remained controversial. Some hailed him as a savior, others condemned him as the pharaoh who defied morality for survival. In the end, Egypt endured, but the story of the dark secret that bound the pharaoh and his daughter became a tale passed down through generations, a reminder of the gods' mercy and their unforgiving judgment.